American classical music is a unique anomaly in the world of classical music. It is the only style of music in America that did not originate or bubble up naturally from the populace, as opposed to contemporary music, i.e. jazz, rock, soul, blues, etc. Being as such, American classical music has always taken on a bizarre form of singularity, wishing to fully distance itself from its European roots, while still adhering to some of the guiding principles developed from said roots, not unlike America itself. And in this melange of sounds, influence, and philosophies, none of this is more apparent than in a composer like Moondog. Now, if you've never heard of Moondog, or even if you've just cursorily heard of him, chances are you probably would not know what to make of a man who dressed as a pagan Viking and stood silently on 6th Avenue in Manhattan for over a decade as uptown Manhattanites passed him by. Most people, when they think of Moondog, often view him as some sort of tertiary counterculture figure of the Beat generation, akin to Kerouac, Cassidy, or Ginsberg, etc. In fact, of the few people I surveyed about Moondog, almost all of them were surprised to learn that he in fact made music and was a composer of some renown. I thought he was just some famous street person from New York, like one of those costume people who was homeless, one friend told me. Now, these misconceptions about Moondog have abounded for years, if not decades. In fact, among all my musician friends I talked to, again, none of them even knew he was a musician, and a prolific one at that. And that is where I and the Lost series come in. We are going to rectify some of the misconceptions about the legendary Moondog today, and showcase what a truly revolutionary composer and musician he was in American history, and see how his incredible innovations are still being felt even today. The incredible tale that is Moondog's life begins in Maryville, Kansas in 1917. Then known as Thomas Lewis Harden, Moondog's life quickly saw him moving around the country at a young age, participating in various activities including being the main drummer for his high school band, as a small child sitting in the lap of an Arapaho chieftain during a ceremonial sun dance, and sadly, losing his eyesight at the age of 16 due to the explosion of a stray dynamite cap. This last event would prove to be profound in Moondog's life, as it would force him as a musician to reconstitute himself, as he had to relearn how to read sheet music, this time in Braille form. After learning to read Braille, he was then able to study music briefly while residing in Arkansas, before packing up in 1943 to take on the Big Apple, as it was then, as it is now, the biggest hub for contemporary classical music in the United States. After arriving in New York City, amazingly, Moondog ended up befriending many prominent high flyers in the New York music scene, who not only enjoyed his company, but recognized the genius of his musical ability. Among these were Leonard Bernstein, Arturo Toscanini, Igor Stravinsky, and Charlie Parker. However, the most consequential of Moondog's new acquaintances was New York City Philharmonic principal conductor Arturo Toscanini. Amazingly, in a city of thousands of young conservatory students desperate to get their works programmed, it was the bearded, street-living Moondog who Rodzinski recognized had true potential to be a composer of serious merit. He allowed Moondog wide latitude to interact with both him and the orchestra. He was more or less allowed to come and go as he pleased, sit in on rehearsals, and work with individual members of the orchestra to get a fuller understanding of how sections and individual instruments work together. Though Rodzinski stepped down in 1947, the time Moondog spent studying with the orchestra would prove to be invaluable to him leading up to his 1969 self-titled magnum opus. Despite the loss of connection from the New York City Philharmonic in the form of Rodzinski, Moondog had still made so many connections in his brief time in NYC that by 1952 he was able to secure a recording contract with legendary jazz label Prestige, and proceeded to put out a series of records in the early to mid-50s that showcase his growing fascination with Native American rhythms, classical harmonies, found sounds, and tape loop experiments. Hell, on a somewhat random note, Moondog also found the time during this period to record a full-fledged album of his compositions with Julie Andrews singing. Yes, that Julie Andrews. Now, when Moondog arrived in New York City in the 1940s, He was sporting a look that could be very much called proto-hippie, i.e. long hair, flowy robes and garments, various beads and jewels, etc. However, because of this, people often remarked to Moondog that he had a, quote, Christ-like aura, unquote, about him. This annoyed Moondog to no end. This was in part because after the previously mentioned traumatic injury involving the dynamite cap, Moondog condemned Christianity as fake due to his belief that a divine God would have intervened to stop the horror he experienced. Subsequently, in order to ward off the idea that he in any way agreed with Christianity or its tenets, he began donning the now famous Viking outfit he wore when posted up on 6th Street daily. By the end of his initial 1950s run of albums, Moondog was fully dressed in the way we identify him today. However, despite securing his identity, it would be about 15 years until Moondog resumed his recording career, and in this subsequent gap between 1957 and 1969, he spent most of his time in the streets of New York, panhandling, occasionally selling original sheet music of his, as well as reciting aphorisms that sounded like they came right out of Also Sprach Zarathustra. And so, for 15 years, Moondog faded into the background of the cultural zeitgeist that was avant-garde New York City in the 1960s. However, in 1969, that all changed when he came out of semi-retirement to show the world the full realization of his musical ideas on 1969's self-titled album. Moondog's self-titled record from 1969 is an absolute classic, both as a piece of classical music as well as a well-sequenced album akin to any other classic from the late 60s epic, including Jimi Hendrix, The Beatles, Bob Dylan, The Doors, etc. And before we dive into the exact nature of the music, I just want to remark on one aspect of Moondog's artistry. He was one of the few classical musicians, in my estimation, who really got what an album was as an artistic format. Now, most classical musicians that I know make what I would call recordings, not necessarily albums. A conductor like, say, Herbert von Karajan made thousands and thousands of classical recordings from Beethoven to Schumann, Sibelius, etc. But if you asked Karajan what makes a great album, i.e. sequencing, album cover, editing effects, specifically the ambient noises and tape splices of speech that we hear in this album, I guarantee he would give you a look like, what? This is where Moondog entirely differs. The pieces presented on the self-titled record don't just exist independently of each other, their entire essence together is what makes this album what it is. There's no doubt that Moondog was well aware of the concept of laying out a great track list, and from the opening notes of Theme right to the ending cadence of Symphonique 1, he demonstrated this fully. In fact, if we go over the names of certain pieces throughout the Moondog album, we can see, consciously or not, Moondog ended up composing in a manner to best complement the album format. Instead of composing a full-fledged 4-movement symphony, Moondog ended up composing 3 symphoniques and 1 mini-sim, musical formats of his own making that were intended to compress the majesty of a full symphony into a 5-minute piece that would in many ways mimic a slightly long pop song and, you guessed it, fit well time-wise and flow-wise on a vinyl record, while still leaving room for other compositions. Important to note, most classical recordings of this time had whole symphonic movements dominate entire sides of a record. In addition to Moondog's understanding of the album era and its artistic merits, the music itself contained within said record is nothing short of astonishing. Despite his reputation as the composer who essentially kicked off the minimalist movement, much of the compositions on Moondog are not so much minimalist as miniaturized. The previously mentioned Symphoniques 1, 3, and 6, as well as the mini-sim, more or less take a highly tonal approach a la Schumann or Tchaikovsky, but this approach is then compressed into a bite-sized piece. While this might not sound highly radical, the attempt to compress a full symphony into bite-sized pieces ended up creating a highly rambunctious, semi-volatile, excitable form of symphonic music that could only exist in the album era. Also, it is important to note the jazz influence on Moondog. Well, not exactly influence, but more an incorporation. You see, Moondog really didn't believe in improvisation or the general jazz ethos. In this way, he was the musical conservative he claimed to be. While he did admire Charlie Parker enough to put a beautiful tribute on this album entitled Bird's Lament, the entire piece is written out and orchestrated by Moondog himself. For Moondog, improvisation was of no importance, but the unique harmonies of jazz music were ultimately the aspect he found most appealing. And one last element that has to be mentioned about this seminal work is Moondog's obsession with Native American percussion. Throughout the album, no matter what style of composition one encounters, Moondog is almost always certain to provide the piece with an auxiliary hand drum percussion part that pushes the piece forward and again distinguishes him from most other classical composers who, while they may use percussive elements, often do not use them in such a way to emphasize a pseudo-backbeat as we see here. Needless to say, the incredible triumph that was 1969's Moondog firmly established Moondog in the eyes of many, including composers like Steve Reich and Philip Glass, as one of the great artistic visionaries of American classical music. Nonetheless, at the dawn of the 70s, Moondog was beginning to grow tired with what he called the, quote, Pepsi-Cola Nation. He released a follow-up, also on Columbia Records in 1971, entitled Moondog 2, which featured vocals from his daughter over simple harpsichord-based canons recalling the style of Bach. However, after this, Moondog ultimately wished to travel to Germany, the land of the Vikings, and visit the Rhine River, a place he had dreamt of often. It was in Germany that he would spend the rest of his life, and where, in many ways, his status as a composer of great importance was cemented. While in Germany, Moondog came to live with a woman named Ilona Goebel, later Sommer, who ended up giving up her entire academic career to guide Moondog's musical one, believing he was some sort of musical messiah. He subsequently spent the rest of his life living with Ilona and her immediate family. Moondog, whose idea of housing in New York we can say was, flexible most times, to put it lightly, ended up for the first time in his life having a steady place to live and time to compose. He referred to this period in his life as a composer's paradise. During this time, Moondog continued to release various albums under the titles of Moondog in Europe, Heart Songs, and Elpmaas, among others. Throughout this time, many major festival orchestras commissioned works from Moondog, further cementing his status as a vitally important composer of the 20th century. He would write down the music for his compositions in Braille, while Ilona Summers would then transcribe said compositions into standard notation, which were then subsequently given to orchestras, most notably in Sweden, who commissioned work from Moondog multiple times between 1981 and 1987. After a life full of music and adventure, Moondog passed away quietly on September 8, 1999, surrounded by Ilona Sommer and her family. Moondog's legacy as a figure in the American counterculture often overshadowed his legacy as a classical composer. However, that in no way diminishes the incredible, innovative, and groundbreaking music he composed and released during his lifetime. In fact, in his unique understanding of the way modern music was produced, he in some ways surpassed any other composer of the 20th century. Moondog deserves a place among all the titans of 20th century composition, along with Bernstein, Part, and John Adams, to name a few. And all these reasons and more is why Moondog should no longer be lost.